December 5, 1941. The Russian steppe lay silent beneath a suffocating sheet of snow. Temperatures had fallen below -40. The wind howled through the skeletons of burned-out villages, carrying the smell of diesel, frost, and fear. Along the frozen roads east of Smolensk, the once invincible Wehrmacht crawled forward, hungry, exhausted, and unprepared for the nightmare that was about to consume them. For 6 months, German troops had marched relentlessly across the Soviet Union, crushing everything in their path. Cities fell like dominoes: Kiev, Minsk, Smolensk. To Berlin, victory seemed certain. Hitler boasted that one more push would bring him to Moscow by Christmas. But the Russian winter had arrived, not as weather, but as a weapon. Tanks froze in place, rifles jammed with ice, and men wrapped themselves in captured curtains and blankets just to survive the night. The same soldiers who had marched triumphantly through Paris now shivered in snow-filled trenches, their breath turning to crystals before their eyes. They were discovering, too late, what Napoleon had learned a century earlier: no one conquers Russia in winter. The Germans called it der Russische Winter, as if the season itself were an enemy. Engines froze solid overnight. Oil thickened like glue. Machine guns refused to fire. Horses died standing up, their bodies turning to statues of ice. Soldiers lit fires inside barrels, holding their hands over flickering flames that gave more smoke than warmth. But even fire was dangerous. Smoke drew Soviet snipers who watched silently from the tree leans. One crack of a rifle, and a man would fall into the snow without a sound. In Berlin, Hitler had promised his men that the war in the East would last no more than a few weeks. Instead, they were now trapped hundreds of miles from home, fighting not just an army, but the land itself. Across the lines, the Red Army was awakening. Reinforcements, hardened by years in Siberia and Central Asia, poured into the front. They wore thick winter uniforms, their rifles wrapped in rags to keep from freezing. Soviet soldiers moved like ghosts through the blizzards, quiet, invisible, unstoppable. And as temperatures plunged even lower, the Germans realized something horrifying: their enemy wasn't retreating anymore. Near Moscow, the sound of artillery echoed through the white void. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, had reached the outskirts of the Soviet capital. German troops could see the distant glow of Moscow's fires, they were that close. But the glow wasn't from surrender. It was from resistance. On December 5, Georgy Zhukov unleashed the Battle of Moscow counteroffensive. Hundreds of thousands of fresh Soviet troops stormed forward through the snow. Ski battalions, tank brigades, and cavalry divisions, yes, cavalry, charged through the drifts, slashing at the frozen German lines. The German advance halted. Then, it broke. Imagine it, a blizzard roaring across the steppe, Soviet soldiers wearing white camouflage gliding over snowdrifts, bayonets gleaming in the pale light. German soldiers, wrapped in torn blankets, fired blindly into the storm. Radios failed, supplies froze, morale shattered. The once proud invaders now fought only to survive. One diary entry from a German private reads: "The cold is worse than the Russians. It creeps into your bones. We no longer dream of victory, only warmth. Every mile of retreat was agony. Trucks refused to start. Men pulled artillery by hand. Frostbite ate through flesh, toes and fingers turned black and brittle. Medics had no bandages, only strips of paper torn from field maps. The Red Army pressed forward mercilessly. Soviet T-34 tanks, with wide tracks built for snow, moved where German Panzer IVs could not. Their engines still roared in -30. The T-34's sloped armor deflected German shells, and their diesel engines kept burning when others failed. To the Germans, these machines seemed almost supernatural, an army born from the ice. At night, Soviet artillery turned the snowfields red. The Wehrmacht's radio operators called frantically for air support, but Luftwaffe planes couldn't take off. Engines froze on the runways. Fuel turned to gel. In some sectors, the Germans abandoned entire divisions, leaving behind the dead and wounded alike. The Soviets captured thousands, their uniforms so thin they looked like shadows against the snow. One Soviet officer recalled, "We found them sitting in the open, staring at nothing. Their eyes were blue from the cold." The myth of German invincibility was dying in the snowdrifts outside Moscow. By January 1942, the German High Command had begun to panic. Adolf Hitler refused to allow retreats, ordering his men to hold every position, to the last man. In the field, that meant one thing: death. Entire units were encircled by Soviet forces and wiped out. Commanders lost contact with their divisions. Supplies ran out. Soldiers ate frozen bread and scraped ice for water. Some burned ammunition crates just to keep warm. Meanwhile, Soviet morale soared. Propaganda posters in Moscow showed Red Army soldiers in white coats, rifles raised, driving the invaders into the snow. The people saw, for the first time since 1941, that the tide could turn. Zhukov's counteroffensive didn't destroy the Wehrmacht, not yet, but it broke its spirit. German generals began to realize they weren't fighting an army of peasants. They were facing a nation willing to fight until the earth itself froze over. A new understanding spread through the ranks: the Soviets were not the weak enemy Berlin had promised. They were something far worse, an enemy that refused to die. Through the next 2 winters, from Stalingrad to Kursk, the pattern repeated. Each summer, the Germans advanced. Each winter, they bled. By late 1943, Hitler's soldiers were no longer horrified just by the Red Army, they were haunted by the memory of the cold. Veterans spoke in whispers of the endless snow, the frozen rivers, and the invisible Soviet soldiers who appeared from the blizzard like ghosts. In post-war interviews, survivors of Army Group Center admitted that it wasn't Soviet weapons that broke them, it was the realization that they could not match the enemy's endurance. The Red Army had learned to fight in ice and shadow, and that adaptability turned the Eastern Front into a graveyard for the German dream of conquest. When I teach this chapter of history, I remind my students, the winter of 1941 didn't just stop an army, it shattered an empire's illusion of invincibility. The German soldiers came to Russia believing they would master the cold. But in the end, the cold, and the will of the Red Army, mastered them.